is not among Democrats or Republicans in the Congress. We could reach a bipartisan consensus today, but if the President doesn't lead it and promote it, it won't happen.
Contain these three elements: a lid on the growth in military spending, a lid on automatic increases in the budget, including outlays for Social Security, and a revision of the three-year tax cut, making the final year contingent on a balanced budget or a reduced deficit. So far, Jones says the White House has given no sign on where it stands.
Citizens in one...
Compromise is not struck soon. That, according to House Budget Committee Chairman James Jones of Tulsa today. Jones told reporters in his Tulsa office that it's up to the president to prevent a congressional deadlock on the '83 budget.
The mere fact that these discussions are continuing indicates that both sides want to try to reach a bipartisan consensus if possible. But clearly President Reagan is the key to it. The problem is not among Democrats or Republicans in the Congress. We could reach a bipartisan consensus today, but if the President doesn't lead it and promote it, it won't happen.
For his part, the president told reporters today he plans to remain on the sidelines in the budget negotiations between the administration and Congress. The president said that the negotiators are optimistic about reaching a compromise, but he won't look at any plan until negotiators feel that that plan has a possibility.
In fiscal 1983, if a compromise is not struck soon. That, according to House Budget Committee Chairman James Jones of Tulsa. Jones told reporters in his Tulsa office yesterday that it is up to President Reagan to prevent a congressional deadlock on the 1983 budget.
The mere fact that these discussions are continuing indicates that both sides want to try to reach a bipartisan consensus if possible. But clearly President Reagan is the key to it. The problem is not among Democrats or Republicans in the Congress. We could reach a bipartisan consensus today, but if the President doesn't lead it and promote it, it won't happen.
House Speaker Tip O'Neill isn't acting very optimistic about a budget compromise either. Susan Spencer reports.
And I hope that the Easter recess finds Speaker O'Neill stumping on home turf, decrying the president's proposed cuts in student loans yesterday at the University of Massachusetts. The speaker said that's just one example of the unfairness of a program which hasn't worked and which won't work. Later, O'Neill said he hopes the talks aimed at a compromise budget to fix things will succeed. But he charged, though the Democrats are ready to compromise, the president has shown no flexibility at all.
He seems to be in cement as far as the defense is concerned, and as far as his tax bill is concerned. Democracy is the art of compromise. He thinks compromise apparently is retreat. I think he's sending a bad message out to the financial markets of America.
In an appearance last night before folks who care about those financial markets, the Cambridge Chamber of Commerce, the speaker warned that without an agreement, a real depression could spread across the country. He said he doesn't blame the president's program entirely, but added that any remedy will be so painful it hasn't a chance without Mr. Reagan, who has kept arm's length from the budget talks.
And I hope that he'll alert the American people, something that he has failed to do, failed to admit at midterm, that his program has been a failure. We're in a crisis, Mr. President. You are the leader. We can work our way out. Thank you.
Whereupon the business-oriented chamber made the speaker its man of the year, a decision, he joked, which could cost them their national charter. Susan Spencer, CBS News, Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Committee, he's a Democrat from Oklahoma, and he's with Steve Bell in Washington. Morning, Mr. Jones. Welcome back.
Good morning, David. How are you?
Fine, thank you. How are you? That's more to the point. You've got a job on your hands today. We understand that one Republican official said that today's negotiating session may be the last, that this whole process may be, to quote him, dead in the water. What's your reading of it?
Well, I think we've reached the point that we have to either fish or cut bait. Either we're going to make some sort of a genuine compromise that's going to help the economy, or we ought to go and let the legislative process do the best it can. I think the fact is that unless President Reagan leads this effort, we're not going to reach a compromise. Unless there's a need for a compromise, it'll never happen.
Well, the president is quoted as saying yesterday that he is willing to look at new taxes and also new defense cuts. How do you read the administration's attitude?
Well, I hope that that's a signal that we can make some of the hard political decisions that are necessary to get the deficits down to size and get those interest rates down.
That sounds like you doubt it.
Well, I'm concerned. In the President's same speech, he said, he used the quote, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it." Well, if the economy is not in bad shape, and if the alternative of further economic deterioration, higher unemployment, higher interest rates, etc., if those are not looming before us, then there is no reason to go through this exercise to fix what many consider to be a broken economy or one that's on the break.
Congressman, how close are we to a breakdown?
Well, I think we're very close to the point that we're either going to make an agreement or we're going to break it open, have disagreement. And we've been at this for 5 weeks now. So far, the President has not been involved in it. Everybody knew from the very beginning that if this is going to work, the President has to be President and lead it. And so I think we're at that point.
You threatened earlier that if we failed to get a compromise, you were going to put Ronald Reagan's original budget on the floor for an up or down vote. You still threatening that?
Well, I think if the President takes the attitude that nothing is in bad shape and that his program just needs to be given a chance, clearly, as Chairman of the Budget Committee and the Budget Committee itself will not stand in the way of putting the President's budget on the floor. I think most people recognize that the President's budget is not supported by a majority of Democrats or Republicans, and that we do need an alternative. But again, the question is, how do we get that alternative? For example, I've taken the position that you can't balance the budget on the backs of Social Security. But the fact remains the Social Security system is in bad shape as long as this economy stays sour. So we've got to deal with that.
What about the report that it's all dead now, there will be no cut or limit on the cost of living increases in Social Security?
Well, I think that those are clearly the reports, and I think that's everybody's intention. What we have to look at is what is necessary to keep the Social Security system viable, alive, soundly, financially sound. That's what's important to those who receive the Social Security checks and benefits, and that's what we have to look at. As far as the economy as a whole is concerned, the issue is high interest rates, which are just throttling this economy. They're increasing the unemployment, they're increasing bankruptcies, and unless we can get the deficits down to size to take pressure off interest rates and ease up somewhat on the monetary policy, we're never going to get this economy straightened out, and that's what we have to look at.
Mr. Jones, what are the consequences specifically if this process drags on? If you don't come up with a compromise, if it goes to an item-by-item kind of check through the rest of the year and drags on maybe to the ST, what are the consequences to the economy?
Well, some people are worried about the budget process. That's not really my main concern. My main concern is exactly what you state, what happens to the economy. I think that if we disagree and if we're unable to reach a comprehensive alternative budget, I think the negative reaction in the financial markets and throughout the economy is going to be very stark, very real. And that's going to lead to upward pressure on interest rates. The upward pressure on interest rates is going to lead to less capital investment. That means more unemployment. And so I think the fears of those who are facing unemployment, the dejection of those who are being forced into welfare will continue.
Mr. Jones, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. We'll be back in just a moment. We'll talk with Professor
The latest
Arthur.
war of words between Tulsa Mayor Jim Inhofe and Congressman Jim Jones. Mayor Inhofe, a Republican, was the guest on News Center 2's Midday Tulsa today. He told host Rocky Madden that Jones, a Democrat, wears two hats.
When Congressman Jones talks here in the city of Tulsa, he talks about small government and big people, but when he talks in groups back there, then he is really very little different than Kennedy or Mondale.
Saying he's two-faced?
Yeah.
Jones said his record is clear, and he told News Center 2 that it's Inhofe who should check his record.
One of the problems Mayor Inhofe has had in being an ineffective mayor of this city is that he's been such a partisan Republican. He's always been that way, and I guess he knows no other way to operate. He's also been caught many times, for example, when he ran against me, as being untruthful, and those are on the record. So I really don't pay much attention to what Mayor Inhofe says when it's in the partisan political vein as this is.
Well, this may just be the start of such exchanges in this election year, the war of words.
But the seat he holds right now. Filing deadline is coming up next week. And News Center 2's Mark Becker reports that Jones' opponents are scrambling to find a candidate.
You know that if the people in Tulsa were actually knowledgeable of the day-to-day operations, of where Mr. Jones goes, who he sees, what he does, and how he votes, I know that they would, in November, replace him.
But replace Jones with whom? Gary Rice is chairman of a conservative committee, part of the National Conservative Political Action Committee, that wants Jones out. But so far, they haven't come up with anyone to run against him.
The people that I visited with were very inexperienced in politics, but they do love this country.
Republican headquarters.
Tulsa County Republicans have their red, white, and blue mascot ready to go, but they don't have a candidate either. Candidates will file formally next week, July 5th through the 7th, with the state election board. Jones himself expects someone to file then, but he says his fairly conservative voting record has already won some Republican support.
I would say at least a third of our campaign organization are members of the Republican Party.
I would seriously doubt that and would like to see those figures and names.
Casey Clugston is the president of Tulsa's Republican Party, and he admits it's an uphill battle against the incumbent Jones, but not a lost one.
Certainly we don't have a Reagan leading the ticket, and that was certainly an asset the last time. But I'm not the prophet of doom and gloom that everyone is putting out.
The Republicans have raised about $50,000 for their campaigns this year, some of which will go to a campaign to defeat Jones. If Nick Pack chips in, there could be considerably more money involved in that campaign. But both the Republicans and the Conservatives have yet to take the first step and even come up with a candidate. And with a filing deadline coming up next week, time is running out. Mark Becker, News Center 2.
The Senate seat vacated by Finus Smith is not
I could have lost my eye. Oh, yeah, there are hundreds of cases of losing an eye from a 3-minute egg. Give it back, Fred.
Offered by congressmen in return for sex. Page told officials he was not personally involved in a homosexual relationship, but told them about such relationships between some of his fellow pages, congressmen, and staff people. And the page says he himself has been homosexually harassed.
I have been approached. And I also know of other people who have been approached. Have you been approached yourself by congressmen? Yes. By male congressmen? Yeah, by male congressmen who ask you, having a party tonight, show you some fun. That kind of thing, with their hand on your shoulder and doing various things with it.
In a 2-hour interview with the FBI, the page also told about drug use among pages, specifically in cocaine. The Drug Enforcement Administration is currently investigating similar charges on Capitol Hill. Pages are high school students who work for congressmen and senators of both parties. Congressional pages are used on the House floor to carry messages and keep paperwork moving. Earlier this year, a Capitol Police investigation turned up information about drug use and what one police source called other irregularities between congressmen and pages. As a result, in February, 3 pages were sent home. One of them, a page overseer, on suspicion of involvement with drugs and prostitution. He says he was forced to resign after another page overheard a suggestive conversation between him and a congressman on the House floor. He alleges having a homosexual relationship with at least 3 congressmen and several staff members. He says it began last year when he was 17. A congressman, he says, approached him while he was working on the House floor and asked him to come to his office after hours.
We just sat there and talked casually about what had gone on that day. And then he kind of made a pass at me. He told me that he thought I was real nice looking and this type of stuff. And I was just in here trying to soak all this in because it was really kind of a shock. And then he just started coming on to me, and one thing just happened after that, one thing after another. We did have a sexual relationship at that time,
With this same congressman, were there other rendezvous like this?
Yeah.
How many times?
3.
3 other times?
Well, 3 including that.
3 including that. Okay. And this was also in his office?
No. One other time was at his apartment. He said it was his apartment. I had heard that it wasn't because I heard that he lived somewhere else. But this is at Watergate.
What's the compensation here? Tell me about that.
Well, I never saw any money. I don't know anybody who ever has. But the way that the Hill works is that you climb the ladder. And so one favor, deserves another. Say, for instance, I was a junior while I was a page. if I wanted to stay my senior year, I could have gotten a sponsorship by another congressman. You know, that's how the favors are returned. If you want to find a job, get a better job, have an extension, something like that, then, you know, that's the way that you're paid. No money is ever involved.
This page overseer has been interviewed by the FBI. Sources say sexual preference is not the issue in the federal investigation, but whether congressmen promised pages jobs or promotions in return for sex, and whether congressmen have been sexually involved with male and female pages who are minors. Justice Department spokesman John Russell acknowledges the investigation and says the FBI is now interviewing several former pages. Russell admits there are allegations against several congressmen. He says it's too early in the investigation to see where it might go. But another official says the FBI has this investigation on the front burner. John Perugia, CBS News, Capitol Hill.
Law enforcement officials involved in the investigation emphasized
race. He drew no Democratic opposition. Robert J. Nichols, Dick Freeman, and Carl Suggs Jr. are the Republicans in that race. In the 2nd Congressional District, incumbent Democrat Mike Siner filed this week, as did Republican Lou Striegel. The Tulsa District Attorney's Office filings were also done in Oklahoma City, and Democratic incumbent David Moss was alone in filing, giving him a new term. In the Tulsa County races, Democratic incumbent Frank Thurman in the sheriff's race was also elected since he drew no opposition. Likewise, in the county treasurer's race, Republican incumbent John Cantrell also had no opponent when the filing period closed. In the county assessor's race, there are 2 Democrats, Ronald Francis Dyer and Michael A. West, who will fight it out for their party's nod to beat incumbent Republican Cheryl Clay. In the 3 county commissioners' races, only incumbent Mel Rice drew no opponents as a Republican, assuring him of another term as the District 3 county commissioner. In District 1, Democratic incumbent Lewis Harris filed along with Republican Frank Buzz Sawyer. In District 2, incumbent Terry Young is unopposed in the Democratic primary. He'll face Republican Bob Bass in the general election.
Commissioners have refiled. In District 1, Democratic incumbent Lewis Harris faces Republican Frank Sawyer. In District 2, Terry Young has one opponent, Republican Bob Bass. Things look pretty cut and dried in District 3. No one has filed against County Commissioner Melvin Rice. But the county assessor position has 3 candidates. Republican incumbent Cheryl Clay will run against Democrats Ronald Dwyer and Michael West. The county treasurer office has only 1 candidate, Republican incumbent John Cantrell. And Frank Thurman is the only person filing for sheriff. Meanwhile, 54-year-old Dick Freeman will try a second time to win the 2nd District congressional seat. Freeman is general manager of Tulsa Air Beechcraft and a general in the Air National Guard. He'll first have to face Tulsa attorney Robert Nichols and restaurant owner Carl Suggs in the primary before he can face off with incumbent.
There's reports that the future doesn't look too bright.
Supervisor experience. Well, I've had probably total that much. As a lead man? Yeah. Okay. Now, the wages they're quoting is negotiable, but we're talking about close to 10.
In these times of high unemployment, this is a familiar scene. But the jobless situation has changed in Tulsa recently, and officials expect the June unemployment rate to go up to 7%. A few months ago, we were told the people who were out of work were those out of work up north who were coming here because of Tulsa's economy. But that has also changed.
These are Tulsans or metropolitan area. A lot of them are from Claremore, Broken Arrow, Wagner. Highly skilled people, and they're out of work. Our influx from out of state stopped about 4 months ago when the word spread that Tulsa's economy had also broken down.
This is a list of the available jobs that this particular employment office knows about. There are about 25 openings on the list, most of them for highly skilled technical workers, such as electricians, welders, and printers. But the pay rate for these jobs are much less than is normally offered for this kind of work. And these are the people that are in the unemployment office, either looking for work or filing for their unemployment benefits. The unemployment office says the Tulsa rate has gone up 27% in the last month, and the number of unemployment benefit claims that are being processed has gone up by over 100%. So, when's it going to get better?
Not a single employer that we know of, that we talk to on almost a daily basis, is predicting a recovery this year Many of them are saying it'll be next spring or next summer. A few of them are saying perhaps the decline is over, but there won't be any recovery in the next 6 to 8 months.
To make the situation worse, because of the federal budget cuts, the unemployment offices are understaffed. They no longer have the people going out looking for job listings.
The administration needs to change its priorities to help the job service program. Jones visited a job service office in Tulsa today. He heard complaints of inadequate staff, too much paperwork, and federal budget cuts. Jones says it's the Reagan administration's fault.
I did not believe and do not believe that the Reagan administration should be increasing foreign aid as they're doing and cutting back on jobs in the employment service.
People hoping for the same.
A lot of people get disgusted, but it takes so long. They just get disgusted and going home and go to a blood bank or something to make money, just to try to survive.
Employees here say they're trying their best to help these people, but in this past year, federal cutbacks have reduced the staff to the point where they say they can do little more than simply file claims. But as if the situation is not bad enough, they fear it could get worse. If Congress approves the new budget the way it stands now, there will be more cutbacks here, and with local unemployment on the rise, District Manager Jim Woods worries about what could happen.
A year ago, we had a staff of 119 people. Currently, we're down to 82. They are talking now of an additional cut in our upcoming 83 budget, and that's going to be a disaster for the employment services nationwide. And without us, I don't know what the people looking for jobs are going to do.
To get their cry for help heard, Congressman Jim Jones, chairman of the House Budget Committee, was asked to come here to see firsthand just what the situation is. And after visiting with the people here today, he pledged his efforts in support of their cause.
Part of Jones's promise is to go back to Washington and fight any budget cuts which could put the Employment Service Office in any further difficulties. But such cuts have already been approved by the Senate, and Jones doesn't have much time to convince a budget-weary House to do otherwise. Stan White.
As chairman of the House Budget Committee, Oklahoma's 1st District Congressman James Jones of Tulsa will be in on the discussion. Jones says he's concerned about taxes proposed on independent and royalty oil and gas owners. Tonight we talked to Congressman Jones and to one of his opponents, Dick Freeman, who was also in Tulsa today to open his campaign headquarters.
Now, there are a lot of features to it that many of which I disagree with. One of the concerns that I have is an attempt by both Republicans and Democrats in the House to add substantially new taxes to the oil and gas industry, particularly on independent producers and royalty owners. As I have tried to convince them, this is the wrong target, the wrong people at the wrong time, particularly now. And so our big effort is going to be to make sure that oil and gas producing states such as Oklahoma are not unfairly taxed in this tax increase.
If there is any threat to the oil people, it's going to come from the Democrats in the Ways and Means Committee. We need to watch them very carefully. They are going to try to add taxes onto what the Senate has added.
Do you know of any numbers that they're talking about?
I do not know the numbers because that's behind closed doors right now, but I can just guarantee you that they're planning on raising the taxes over what the Republican Senate voted.
Both candidates also commented on the doubling of the excise tax on cigarettes. Jones said the tax would affect the middle-class citizens the most. Freeman says he thinks the tax will represent a broad income group, not putting a burden on
Congress
one.
met with Congressman Jim Jones to get some face-to-face answers on what's happening in Washington and what Jones is doing to help their situation.
It's important because we've got half of the steel workers, for example, are unemployed in Oklahoma today, and that is in general anyone in the oil industry, the steel industry, and all those industries are being hit hard.
If we don't get the interest rates down, we're never going to get the economy straightened out. You're never going to get capital investment moving in the steel industry, the auto industry, or anything else.
While the job picture continues to worsen, steelworkers are beginning to question Oklahoma's unemployment compensation and whether it's legal.
We're asking the unemployment questions mainly because Oklahoma just pays out about 10 weeks of unemployment benefits. We understand that all other states have a 26-week program, and we also understand that's a federal requirement.
I will work to have the 13-week extended unemployment benefits passed by Congress just as quickly as possible, and I hope we can do it before, certainly before middle of August.
They're also beginning to ask tough questions about balancing the budget and new federalism and what all that means in terms of jobs. They're hoping Jones will carry their message back to Washington, and although he says he will, he also warns that the root of the problem lies with the current economic policies.
Now, I don't think that tax bill would pass the House. I have a lot of disagreements with it, but one of my main concerns is to make sure that those who would like to take another whack at oil-producing states don't put an unfair tax burden on independent producers and royalty owners.
One of the men who wants Jones' job opened his campaign headquarters today. Republican Dick Freeman believes the tax increase approved by the Senate is part of a compromise.
The President Reagan said he did not want any tax increases. He could not get Tip O'Neill to agree with that, and so the compromise that the Congress put together was something that the President did not actually start out wanting. But I'm very happy that Senator Nichols and several of them were able to keep the oil tax out, able to keep the energy out from being concentrated on like they were with the windfall profit tax.
Freeman will face fellow Republicans Robert Nichols and Carl Suggs in the August primary election.
And here's a young lady that may be...
The nation's economic picture was going to improve later this year. Many leading Democrats disagreed with the projections. So did a lot of Republicans, as a matter of fact, including some who are working pretty closely with the president. We'll find out more in a few minutes. We'll talk with Malcolm Baldridge, who is Secretary of Commerce. He's a Democrat from Oklahoma. He's with me here in New York, and so is David Jones, who is a leading Wall Street economist. Good morning, gentlemen. Welcome.
Good morning.
David Jones, first. This economic report that came out of the White House suggests the recession has bottomed out. Do you think it's bottomed out? And if so, if not, what do you think is going to happen in the next 12 months?
No, the recession is not bottomed out. We'll see another 6 months of recessionary-type economic activity at least. We may move well into 1983 before we see any hope of recovery. So the plan the administration has given us, whether it's political wishful thinking or what may be the case, is grossly optimistic. Every administration gives us optimism. This one is much too optimistic in terms of the outlook for the economy. Interest rates are too high, as the Secretary suggests. They're not coming down very much because deficits are too big. There just isn't any hope of pulling Main Street USA out of a nosedive.
What do you think has to be done? What does the Congress, the administration have to do in your judgment to speed up the good news?
The problem is the policy mismatch. Money is much too tight. Fiscal policy is still much too loose. They're clashing, crowding everybody else out. You and I, mortgage borrowers, small businesses. What we need is a change in the dials. We need to see more action on the fiscal side. The Senate has taken a step in the right direction in trying to move toward a lower deficit, but we need massive moves. We need something much more striking. Perhaps we won't have it until after election at the earliest. Second thing is we do need more monetary ease. We've had a little bit. Rates have come down some, but not nearly enough to give us any chance of sustained economic recovery.
Congressman Jones, same question. Where do we stand right now, and what do you think has to be done?
Well, our best analysis is that the best case scenario in the near future is that we'll rock along as we are now, no particular recovery. And it could deteriorate even further. So I would agree with David Jones on his analysis that we're not going to have any real improvement, and the mid-session review released last Friday was very, very optimistic, a truly rosy scenario that can't be achieved. As far as what needs to be done, again, not changing the basic goals of trying to reduce the growth in federal spending and to reduce the deficits, but I think you have to change the mix of policies. We do have to tighten up further on fiscal policy, which means further cuts in spending, particularly in those areas that haven't been touched before, such as military expenditures. And secondly, to restore some of the revenue base that was so depleted and devastated in last year's tax bill. To get the fiscal policy under control, then we can ease up on the monetary policy and see interest rates come down without inflation.
Congressman Jones, if it needs that kind of prescription for change, why in the world are the Democrats in the House just rolling over and playing dead on all the administration's economic proposals?
Well, I don't think it's a question of rolling over and playing dead. It's a question of practical working majorities. And very clearly, the Reagan administration has a partisan majority in the Senate and a working majority in the House, and we don't have the votes to change the mix of policies. We tried to do that last year by having lower deficits, a tax bill that was not as expansionary as the administration recommended, but we lost that vote. I think there's general acceptance, had we won our budget and implemented it, deficits would be lower, interest rates would be lower, and unemployment would be lower.
Secretary Baldridge, I think it's time for a response.
Well, I think the Joneses are about half right. You know?
Which half? The Jones boys.
Yeah. Well, in their emphasis on bringing the budget deficit down, Congress has simply got to find the will to do that. It's no use for just the administration to have the will, but can't get through Congress. We need the deficits brought down strongly, much more strongly than they've been down. Now, that's the part I do agree with.
What your critics would say is that it's the policies of the Reagan administration in terms of last year's tax cut and the rate of defense spending that are causing the deficit.
Well, we didn't get all the cuts we wanted. There are a lot of cuts yet that have to be made that Congress has got to find the will for. We'll address those in the next budget.
What about in the defense area? Excuse me, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Jones suggested, Jim Jones suggested in the defense area, untouched. How about in that area?
I think that we have to look at the whole budget, everything. Nothing should be sacrosanct in next year's budget review. It's that difficult a question. Now, that's the part I think they're right on. On the recession, I think they're about 6 months late in their predictions, really.
You do expect a good turnaround.
Yes, we are between the recession and coming out of it. We're seeing the consumer begin to lead this country out of a recession. It's going to be a slow, steady kind of a growth. It won't be strong if interest rates don't come down, but there will be a recovery willy-nilly.
But when are we going to see the business community turn around? Consumers may be spending more, but business is not investing in new plants and equipment.
About 15 seconds, Mr. Secretary, go ahead.
They won't. Business can't invest until the consumer spending fills up the pipelines, generates increased orders at the factory. That's usually a 4 to 6 months process. But in the meantime, the recovery will start with the consumers.
Mr. Secretary Baldridge, thank you, sir, very much. Jim Jones, thank you. David Jones, thank you. We'll be back in just a moment.
Shopping after we got off work, yes. Shop in hell. all right. So we had one drink. At the Pink Parrot, I suppose. Oh, Mama, the Pink Parrot is a wonderful place. We just sit around there and we sing and we have such a good time. The piano player there told me I have this wonderful voice. It is disgusting. Getting tanked up in that dump night after night with another middle-aged woman who couldn't hold on to her husband either. The Pink Parrot, Mama, is not a dump. For your information, it is a very high-class place. Corporation presidents go in there. Oh, is that who's going to call tonight, I suppose? A corporation president? Well, it just so happens that I met this very nice gentleman in there, and he's a vice president of a corporation, and he said he was going to call me tonight. Can you stand it? Some drunken bum you're expecting to take you out and ask you to marry him. You are insufferable. Why would you assume that only a drunken bum would ask me out? Speaking of bums, I didn't set a place for Billy. He won't be home tonight. Where is he? Well, I don't know. Somebody honked their horn and he went running out of here. Mama, I grounded that boy for a whole month. Why didn't you stop him? Well, what was I supposed to do? Tackle him and sit on him until you're finished boozing with that nitwit Naomi? First Bubba and now Billy. Lord, I can't handle those boys alone. Well, I told you if you married that Ed Higgins, you was going to have freaks for kids, and that's what you got. Oh, that's my coat! That's my coat! That's my coat!
Hello? James R. Jones, who spoke before a session on state and local economy. The congressman wasted no time in going on the offensive against Reaganomics and a balanced budget amendment. But as Tim Miller reports via satellite, Jones had to make some defensive moves as well.
Cuts that I mentioned.
Congressman Jones addressed a committee on state and local government and how the redistribution of federal programs will affect them. Jones reviewed his support of the principle of supply-side economics. That's cutting programs, not raising taxes, but added that the way the president was approaching it was disastrous. In light of the proposed constitutional amendment for a balanced budget passed last week by the Senate, Jones told the governors that he thought it was a White House cover-up of failing economic principles.
I believe when historians review the debate of this constitutional balanced budget amendment in the context in which it occurs, they may well record that this was the economic Watergate of the 1980s, because it is a cover-up, a massive cover-up, for a lack of political judgment and economic judgment. And I think it's that we have to address.
A strong accusation from the House Budget Committee chairman. Some of the governors agreed with Jones and told him so.
You get Budget Director Domenici and Budget Chairman Jones together, I think we might be able to work this thing out. I'd move that all right now.
While Matheson praised Jones for his efforts, the Budget Chairman did face some direct hits from Wisconsin Republican Lee Dreyfus.
I hold you and people around you responsible for where we are, and I think for you to come in and say it's either this administration or your latest concession to go back into Mr. Carter's period. I think we better get back to Texas and get back to Jim Jones.
Well, I can't take responsibility for everything, as the President said the other night, but
some of it.
I will say the last time we had a surplus budget was the last year of the Johnson administration when, in fact, I was Chief of Staff at the White House.
All right, but you did that in part by financing a war without going with it where it should have been in run. And if we want to go back on that discussion, I'll be glad to tell you where that led us, in my opinion. Your notion that if we have an amendment, Congress is going to make a sham out of it, your view then of both Congress and the people of the United States, I think, is due for some radical changes. Something's happening out there with the people, and frankly, don't overestimate their knowledge, I agree, but they're beginning to smarten up, but never underestimate their intelligence, and something's happened out there, and they're going to make Congress come to scratch if, in fact, they have to do it constitutionally. I'll give you that as a flat-out prediction.
This debate shows exactly why the governors are 5 months late in developing a proposal on federalism. They are all fighting for the same cause. They just happen to be using different deficit.
He called it a crisis, laying it all at the feet of supply-side economics. Governor Dreyfus of Wisconsin disagreed.
Let's go back to Lyndon Johnson and his White House staff, of which you became Chief of Staff.
Right.
And are you not personally responsible for setting in motion? I hold you and people around you responsible for where we are, and I think...
And knowing the nation's news media would be here, he chose today to begin a campaign against an amendment to balance the federal budget.
I believe when historians review the debate of this constitutional balanced budget amendment in the context in which it occurs, they may well record that this was the economic Watergate of the 1980s, because it is a cover-up, a massive cover-up.
It's the first real salvo that Congressman Jones has fired against the balanced amendment budget. It's too early to tell yet whether he'll accomplish anything with it. With a live action cam at Shangri-La, Mark Nix, News Center 2.
Oh, did Congressman Jones get any support in his effort to defeat a balanced budget amendment?
Karen, it's real hard to tell. Of course, he's right here in his own backyard. There's a lot of support for not only President Reagan, but his economic program, but...
Conference, he reports that the new federalism and budget balancing dominated today's meetings.
After a rainy night, the sun was shining on Shangri-La today. All the cameras were rolling as Oklahoma Governor George Nye introduced Vermont Governor Richard Snelling, the chairman of the Governors Association. Reporters immediately bombarded Snelling with questions about the negotiations between governors and President Reagan over a new federalism.
You know, the 6 months was not wasted. We learned a great deal, and we resolved an awful lot of subjects. But there were some big ones that were left behind.
Snelling later explained to the NGA's executive committee what the White House has left behind. First, the governors want federal Medicaid coverage for families hit by huge medical bills. Second, they want a federal fund to help financially troubled states keep welfare programs going. Third, they want to do away with a rule that says if a family receives aid for dependent children, it must give up 30% of its food stamps. And fourth, the governors want the states to have the power to give a family more Medicaid and, at the same time, more aid for dependent children. Congressman Jim Jones of Tulsa skipped over new federalism in his remarks to governors today, but the chairman of the House Budget Committee did get his digs in on President Reagan's call for a constitutional amendment to balance the budget.
Natural disasters would have to give about a 6 months notice before they happened to the Congress so that we could get it in the budget and be honest about it.
Governor Nye had already made it clear that he differed with Congressman Jones on the budget issue.
Are subject to a point of order, and those bills cannot be considered to be sent to the President for his signature into law. That point of order can be overridden by a majority vote. Our bill would intend to make a stronger vote, such as a 3/5 vote.
As yet, Jones hasn't taken a position on the tax bill.
Congressional candidate Dick Freeman called the hand of 1st District Congressman Jim Jones. Freeman says Jones' statutory amendment won't work.
His balanced budget statute is nothing but political quackery. It's just an excuse for him to not support a balanced budget amendment.
He says only a constitutional amendment would do the job to balance the budget. And the latecomer in the primary election, Democratic candidate for Governor Howard Bell, spoke out loud and strong today. Bell says he's fed up with the growing size of state government.
A big portion of the tax increase would be imposed on Oklahoma oil operations, but claims that is no longer a concern. Still, he calls it one of his toughest personal decisions since going to Washington.
If we don't pass the tax increases, the big spenders are not going to let us have any of the spending cuts, and then we could well be looking at the $180 billion deficits, and that would probably be the worst of all the evils that we're contemplating. So,
on the other hand, Jim Jones appeared more concerned with the spending reductions included in the package and how that might affect individuals, especially the elderly.
For example, there's a lot of complaints about the withholding of interest and dividend income. Particularly a lot of retired people are very worried about that. And so that's one of the things we're going to look at. The 10% withholding may be an over-withholding for the majority of taxpayers. If that's the case, it's not very good reform.
Both Nichols and Jones are waiting to get what they call a better picture of everything to be included in the plan before deciding which way they'll vote. And in less than an hour, President Reagan will try to help clear up some of their questions in a nationally televised speech aimed at drumming up support for the measure, which his aides say faces an uphill battle. Both the House and the Senate are expected to vote on the package later this week. Stan Whiteford, News Center 2.
And of course, TV2 will carry the president's speech live tonight beginning at 7 o'clock.
Along with his earlier comments, Congressman Jones also announced today he'll introduce a bill in Congress which will make a balanced budget mandatory. However, unlike the current proposal to add such an amendment to the Constitution, Jones says his would only be a statutory amendment and would go into effect much sooner than the balanced budget amendment now being considered. The Tulsa congressman says he'll introduce his bill on Wednesday. Although Congressman Jones may be pushing for his own budget amendment, one of his opponents, 1st District GOP candidate Dick Freeman, says we need the president's new proposal to balance the budget.
That amendment, or we need to replace Jim Jones and all the big spenders in Congress, or both.
Freeman says we've depended on the nation's lawmakers for many years to get something done, but they've failed. One of the candidates for House District 13 has died at his Muskogee home. Tonight, investigators say 46-year-old Gary Helmer apparently died early today or late last night. Helmer was challenging incumbent state lawmaker Jim Barker.
The president is speaking tonight from the Oval Office in the White House.
My fellow Americans, there's an old saying we've all heard 1,000 times about the weather and how everyone talks about it, but no one does anything about it. Well, many of you must be feeling that way about the present state of our economy. Certainly there's a lot of talk about it, but I want you to know we're doing something about it. And the reason I wanted to talk to you is because you can help us do something about it. Believe me, if some of you are confused, I can understand why. For some time, ever since we started planning the 1983 budget for the fiscal year beginning this coming October 1st, there's been a steady drumbeat of quote-unquote reports on what we're supposed to be doing. I know you've read and heard on the news a variety of statements attributed to various, quote, authoritative government sources who prefer not to have their names used, unquote. Well, you know my name, and I think I'm an authoritative source on this since I'm right in the middle of what's going on here. So I'd like to set the record straight on a few of the things that you might have heard lately. I'm sure you've heard that we're proposing the largest single tax increase in history. The truth is, we're proposing nothing of the kind. And then there's the one that our economic recovery program has failed, so I've abandoned it and turned to increasing taxes instead of trying to reduce federal spending, unquote. Well, don't you believe that one either. Yes, there is a tax bill before the Congress tied to a program of further cuts in spending. It is not, however, the greatest single tax increase in history. Possibly it could be called the greatest tax reform in history, but it absolutely does not represent any reversal of policy or philosophy on the part of this administration or this president. Now, you may have heard that some special interests oppose this bill, and that's right, some do. As a matter of fact, some in the Congress of my own party object to this bill, and strongly. I'm told by many that this bill is not politically popular, and it may not be. Why then do I support it? I support it because it's right for America. I support it because it's fair. I support it because it will, when combined with our cuts in government spending, reduce interest rates and put more Americans back to work again. Now, you'll recall that when our administration came into office a year ago last January, we announced a plan for economic recovery. Recovery from what? From a 1980 recession that saw inflation in double-digit figures for the second year in a row. It was 12.4% when we arrived. Interest rates had gone into outer space. They were at the highest they'd been in 100 years, with a prime rate that hit 21.5%. There were almost 8 million Americans out of work, and in several hard-hit industrial states, there already were pockets of unemployment reaching figures of 15, 18, and even 20%. I went to those areas, I know. The cost of government was increasing at a rate of 17% a year. There was little we could do about the budget already in place, but we could do something about the one that had been proposed for the fiscal year beginning in October of our first year. I had campaigned on the belief that government costs should be reduced and that the percentage of the people's earnings taken by government in taxes should also be reduced. I also said that one area of government spending could not be reduced, but must instead be increased. That was the spending necessary to restore our nation's defenses, which had been allowed to deteriorate to a dangerous degree in the preceding 4 years. Interest rates continued high as the months went by, and unemployment increased, particularly in the automobile industry and housing construction. Few could or would afford the high interest rates for home mortgages or installment buying of an automobile. Meantime, we were putting our economic recovery program in place. It wasn't easy. We didn't get all the cuts we wanted, and we got some tax measures we didn't want. But we were charting a complete turnaround in government policy, and we did get the major part of what we proposed. The Congress mandated spending cuts of $130 billion over 3 years and adopted the biggest tax cut in history. Now, this too was to be implemented over a 3-year period. It began with a 5% cut in the personal income tax beginning October 1st, 1981. Then a 10% cut this last July, and another scheduled for July 1st, 1983. These will be followed by indexing of the tax brackets, so workers getting cost of living pay raises won't be moved up into higher brackets. We have to realize inflation itself is a tax. Government profits by inflation, but indexing will put a stop to that. There were tax cuts for business and industry to help provide capital for modernization of plant and equipment, changes in the estate tax, capital gains tax, and the marriage penalty tax. Some who supported us on the spending cuts were fearful about cutting taxes in view of the continuing budget deficits. We felt the tax cuts had to be a part of our plan in order to provide incentive for individuals and for business to increase productivity and thus create jobs for the unemployed. Now, it's only been 10 months since the first phase of our program went into effect. As I said earlier, there are those who say it's been tried and it failed. Well, as Al Smith used to say, let's look at the record. Start with interest rates, the basic cause of the present recession. The prime rate was, as I said, 21.5%. Well, last week, it was 14.5%, and as of today, 3 major banks have lowered it to 14%. Last week, 90-day Treasury bills were paying less than 9% interest. 1 year ago, they were paying 15.5%. That double-digit inflation, 12.4%, has been cut in half for the last 6 months. Real earnings are at last increasing for the first time in quite a long time. Personal savings, which trended downward throughout the last decade, are increasing. This means more money in the pool of investment capital. This will help further reduce interest rates. All of this, in only 10 months, hardly looks like a program that failed to me. Oh yes, I failed to mention that in the quarter just ended, there was an increase in economic growth, the first such increase in a long time. Our biggest problem, the last one to be solved in every recession, is unemployment. I understand how tough it is for those who are waiting for the jobs that come with recovery. We can have no rest until our neighbors, our fellow citizens who want to work, are able once again to find jobs. Again, let me say, the main obstacle to their doing so is continued high interest rates. Those rates should be lower now than they are with the success we've had in reducing inflation. But part of the problem is psychological, a pessimism in the money markets that we won't stay the course and continue lowering the cost of government. The projected increase in budget deficits has added to that pessimism and fear. And this brings us back to that so-called greatest tax increase in history and the budget proposals now before the Congress. When I submitted the 1983 budget to the Congress in February, it contained very significant spending cuts on top of those we obtained last year. This time, however, we couldn't get the support we had last year. Some who had not been happy about the tax cuts then were now insisting we must have additional tax revenues. In fact, they wanted to cancel the reductions scheduled for next July and cancel the indexing of tax brackets. Others proposed tax increases mounting to about $150 billion over a 3-year period. On top of this, there was resistance to the spending reductions we asked for, and even attempts to eliminate some of last year's cuts so as to actually increase spending. For many months now, we've been working to get a compromise budget that would further reduce spending and thus reduce the deficits. We also have stood firm on retaining the tax cuts already in place because, as I said, they're essential to restoring the economy. We did, however, agree to limited revenue increases so long as they didn't harm the incentive features of our economic recovery program. We ourselves last year had called attention to the possibility of better compliance with the tax laws, collecting taxes legitimately owed, but which were not being paid. Well, weeks and weeks of negotiations resulted in a congressional budget resolution combining revenue increases and further spending reductions. Revenues would increase over a 3-year period by about $99 billion, and outlays in that same period would be reduced by $280 billion. Now, as you can see, that figures out to about a 3-to-1 ratio. $3 less in spending outlays for each $1 of increased revenue. This compromise adds up to a total over 3 years of a $380 billion reduction in the budget deficits. And remember, our original tax reduction remains in place, which means your taxes will still be cut $335 billion in these next 3 years, even with the passage of this present tax bill. Now let me take that $99 billion tax program apart, and you decide whether it's the biggest tax increase in history. Of the entire $99 billion, $32 billion is collection of tax presently owed under the present laws and which is not being paid. Now, to all of you who are paying your tax, simple fairness says we should collect from those who are freeloading. Roughly $48 billion of the $99 billion represents closing off special interest loopholes, which have resulted in unintended tax advantages for some, not all, taxpayers, some who are financially well able to pay their share. Now, this is also a matter of simple fairness. So, more than 80% of the tax bill is not new tax at all, but is better collecting and correcting of flaws in the system. Now, this leaves $19 billion over 3 years of actual new taxes, which is far outweighed by the tax cuts which will benefit individuals. There is an excise tax on cigarettes, another on telephones. Well, for people who smoke a pack a day, that tax will mean an increase of only $2.40 a month. The telephone tax increase is only about 54 cents a month for the average household. Right now, the tax reduction that we passed last year is saving the average family about $400 per year. Next year, even after this new tax bill is passed, the savings will almost double. They'll go to $788. And here's what the totals look like. The new tax reform will raise in 3 years about, as I say, $99 billion. In the same 3 years, as I said a moment ago, our tax cut program, even after this increase, will save you $335 billion. Within the new bill, there has, of course, been disagreement over some of the specific provisions. For example, there's considerable confusion over the proposal to have withholding of tax due on interest and dividends, just as it's withheld now on your wages and salaries. Many senior citizens have been led to believe this is a new tax added on top of the present income tax. Well, there is no truth whatsoever to that. We've found that while the overwhelming majority of Americans faithfully report income from interest and dividends and pay taxes on it, some do not. It's one of the significant areas of non-compliance and is costing the government about $9 billion a year. In the case of those over age 65, withholding will only apply to those with incomes of $14,450 and up per individual and $24,214 for couples filing a joint return. Low-income citizens below 65 will be exempt if their income is less than about $8,000 for an individual or $15,300 for those filing joint returns. And there will be an exemption for all interest payments of $150 or less. The only people whose taxes will be increased by this withholding are those who presently are evading their fair share of the tax burden. Once again, we're striving to see that all taxpayers are treated fairly. Now, this withholding will go into effect next July, not this January 1st, as was earlier reported. Back during the campaign, on September 9th, 1980 to be exact, I said my goal was to reduce by 1985 the share of the gross national product taken by the government in taxes, reduce it to 20.5%. If we had done nothing, it would have risen to almost 25%. But even after passage of this bill, the federal government in 1985 will only be taking 19.6% of the gross national product. Make no mistake about it. This whole package is a compromise. I had to swallow hard to agree to any revenue increase. But there are two sides to a compromise. Those who supported the increased revenues swallowed hard to accept $280 billion in outlay cuts. Others have accepted specific provisions with regard to taxes or spending cuts, which they opposed. There's a provision in the bill for extended unemployment payments in states particularly hard hit by unemployment. If this provision is not enacted, 2 million unemployed people will use up their benefits by the end of March. I repeat, much of this bill will make our tax system more fair for every American, especially those in lower income brackets. I'm still dedicated to reducing the level of spending until it's within our income. And I still want to see the base of the economy broadened so that the individual's tax burden can be further reduced. Over the years, growth in government and deficit spending have been built into our system. Now, it'd be nice if we could just cut that out of our system with a single sharp slice. That, however, can't be done without bringing great hardship down on many of our less fortunate neighbors who are not in a position to provide for themselves. And none of us wants that. Our effort to restore fiscal integrity and common sense to the federal establishment isn't limited to the budget cuts and tax policy. Vice President Bush heads up a task force that's been reviewing excessive regulations. Already, enough unnecessary and duplicative regulations have been eliminated or revised to save an estimated $6 billion every year. Our inspectors general have been mobilized into a task force aimed at ferreting out waste and fraud. They've conducted tens of thousands of audits, secured thousands of indictments resulting in many convictions. In the first 6 months of fiscal 1982 alone, they found $5.8 billion of savings and improved use of funds. Computer cross-checking has uncovered thousands of government checks still going to people who've been dead for several years. Task forces from the private sector are engaged in a study of the management structure of government. What they've learned already indicates a great potential for savings by simply bringing government procedures up to ordinary modern business standards. Our private sector initiatives force, under William Verity, has uncovered hundreds of community and statewide projects performing services voluntarily that once were thought to be the province of government. Some of the most innovative have to do with job training and placement, particularly for young people. What we need now is an end to the bickering here in the Capitol. We need the bipartisan comprehensive package of revenue increases and spending cuts now before the Congress. We need it to be passed. We're not proposing a quick fix, an artificial stimulant to the economy such as we've seen in the several recessions in recent years. The present recession is bottoming out without resorting to quick fixes. Now, there won't be a sudden boom or upsurge, but slowly and surely, we'll have a sound and lasting recovery based on solid values and increased productivity and an end to deficit spending. It may not be easy, but it's the best way, the only way to real and lasting prosperity for all our people. Think of it. We've only had one balanced budget in the last 20 years. Let's look forward to the day when we begin making payments to reduce the national debt instead of turning it all over to our children. You helped us start this economic recovery program last year when you told your representatives you wanted it. You can help again, whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent, by letting them know that you want it continued. Letting them know that you understand that this legislation is a price worth paying for lower interest rates, economic recovery, and more jobs. The single most important question facing us tonight is, do we reduce deficits and interest rates by raising revenue from those who are not now paying their fair share? Or do we accept bigger budget deficits, higher interest rates, and higher unemployment simply because we disagree on certain features of a legislative package which offers hope for millions of Americans at home, on the farm, and in the workplace? Do we tell these Americans to give up hope, that their ship of state lies dead in the water because those entrusted with manning that ship can't agree on which sail to raise? We're within sight of the safe port of economic recovery. Do we make port or go aground on the shoals of selfishness, partisanship, and just plain bullheadedness? The measure the Congress is about to vote on, while not perfect in the eyes of any one of us, will bring us closer to the goal of a balanced budget, restored industrial power, and employment for all who want to work. Together, we can reach that goal. Thank you. God bless you.
It's obvious from the speech this evening that the President is most sensitive to the charge that the tax bill he is now advocating is indeed the largest tax increase in history. He repeatedly denied that tonight and very skillfully avoided calling it a tax increase. He called it repeatedly a revenue increase and said it was necessary to reduce the deficits. This speech this evening by the President, in a manner of speaking, is an admission that his gamble of last year did not pay off. The gamble last year, of course, was that a huge tax cut coupled with spending cuts would stimulate the economy. However, the spending cuts did not cover the tax cuts, and the deficit swelled and the economy worsened. Last Friday, the Democratic leadership of the Congress, Senator Byrd and Speaker O'Neill, requested TV time to respond to the President's speech this evening. Mr. O'Neill designated 10-term Congressman Thomas Foley of the 5th District of Washington. Foley is part of the House leadership. He's the party whip, and he supports this tax increase. Byrd, for his part, selected Senator David Boren, a first-termer from Oklahoma, a member of the Finance Committee, a fiscal conservative, and an early supporter of last year's tax cut, and presumably one who is opposed to the current tax increase. They're speaking from a Senate reception room on Capitol Hill, a room used by the Democrats for their caucuses and informally known as the Taj Mahal because of its elaborate redecoration back in the days when Lyndon Johnson was the Senate leader. Mr. Foley will be the first to speak.
Good evening. I'm Tom Foley, a member of Congress from the state of Washington and a member of the House Democratic leadership. With me is Senator David Boren of Oklahoma. We're speaking to you tonight from the capital of the United States. And first, we want to thank this network for giving us the chance to respond to what President Reagan has said tonight. The issues the President discussed, the condition of our economy, the need to cut interest rates and put people back to work, are matters of crucial importance to all Americans. They are matters of historic concern to those of us in the Democratic Party. Ours is a party dedicated to economic growth, economic opportunity, and economic justice. We believe the most important task our country faces right now is getting millions of unemployed workers back to work, in restoring the dignity and self-reliance of the jobless, and in restoring confidence to those who are concerned about the economic future. President Reagan is trying to rally support for the tax bill now before the Congress. It is obvious that there are major differences within both parties on this bill. Those differences are real. No one person can presume to speak for every member of either party. Yet, weighing the benefits of passing this bill against the costs of not passing it, I have come to the conclusion that despite our differences in the past, this is one occasion when the President's position is right. He said we need this revenue measure, and we do. We need to take action, and action now, in dealing with our country's growing economic crisis. This isn't a matter of political urgency for the President or the Congress. It's a matter of economic urgency for the entire country. I am sure most of you are watching here at home tonight and would agree that you don't want to see a lot of finger-pointing. You watched and listened to the President, and you are watching and listening to us now to get some answers. Looking to the difficult months ahead, there's enough work and enough economic challenge for all of us to share. When we agree together, we must act together for the good of the entire country. To this end, I support the President's position. I take this view not because I support all of the President's economic theories. Democrats do agree with many of the broad goals of economic growth and expansion that this administration favors. But we've had differences with the President on how to attain them. The overwhelming number of Democrats favored cutting taxes. The overwhelming number of Democrats supported strengthening our national security. But we question the wisdom of enacting the largest tax cut in history in the same year that we enacted the largest increase in the defense spending of our country. We felt such a combination, particularly in years to come, only guaranteed enormous deficits and higher interest rates. We Democrats agreed that it was necessary to control federal spending, and we offered billions of dollars in cutbacks in federal spending. But we opposed the President's most severe budget cuts because we felt they were unfair. We felt that last year's tax bill was unfair in giving the greatest benefits to those who already had the most, and it failed to give enough tax relief to those who needed it the most. Where we disagreed with the President, we offered sound and constructive alternatives. In each significant case, those alternatives were rejected, and the President's economic program was adopted and put into effect. Unfortunately, the President's legislative successes did not translate into the economic successes that we all sought. Even the administration's own leadership now admits that the promises made for its program have yet to be realized. The great advantage of the tax bill now before the Congress is that it helps to balance many of the excesses enacted last year. It helps to cut down on the deficits and therefore helps relieve pressure on interest rates. It helps to cut down on the basic unfairness of last year's tax bill. It plugs some major loopholes, and it helps to divide the cost of our society more fairly. The Democratic influence on this compromise bill now before us is unmistakable. We won extended unemployment benefits. We helped to shift the burden from the individual taxpayer. We have worked to protect the benefits of those who needed protection the most. I support the revenue bill because it is fair and because it brings some long overdue moderation to the administration's economic program. We Americans, all of us, have a stake in bringing balance and common sense to our country's economic policies. not only by cutting back in the deficit, but by bringing a measure of fairness to our tax policies. And by this means, we think we can enlist the confidence of the American people in our country's future. I know how important it is to build that confidence because I represent, proudly, an agriculture and industrial area in our country's great Northwest. I know firsthand the hardships that people are feeling today on the farm, in the timberlands, in the many thousands of small businesses, as well as in our major industries. People may not be demonstrating in the streets, they may not be crying out loud, but they are certainly feeling the pain there and throughout the rest of our nation. You have a right to expect that members of both political parties are doing their best to turn the economy around. It has never been easy to pass a tax bill, but somehow we have to take the step to stop the economic slide. This is a critical first step. Some say we need a vote of political courage. Perhaps. I say we need a vote for economic reality. Not long ago, Congressman Richard Bowling of Missouri had a similar opportunity to respond to a presidential address. He said then that our country's problems are not Democratic problems, nor Republican problems. They are American problems, and we must overcome them together. That was 4 months ago. It is even more true today. And it is in that spirit that I join with the President in asking for your support tonight. Senator Boren.
Thank you very much, Congressman Foley. We've all just heard the President discuss the serious economic problems facing us as Americans. He has outlined his support for a $99 billion package of tax increases, which he feels are necessary. It's not my purpose tonight to spend our time together trying to cast blame on the President or the other party for our economic trouble. This weekend, I was visiting in Duncan, Oklahoma with a group of my constituents. Their message to me was, we want you people in Washington to quit wasting your time blaming each other and start working together to solve our problems. I agree with their advice 100%. Blaming each other will not put 10 million people back to work or save countless farmers and small businessmen from bankruptcy. The late Sam Rayburn used to say, to be a good Democrat, you must first be a good American. The Democratic response tonight is offered in that spirit. Let's be frank with each other. We all know that our economy is in trouble. Many Democrats in the Congress, including myself, voted to give the President's program a chance. For the sake of America, I wish that it had been a resounding success. But we must live in the real world, and the fact is that the administration's program is not working. As this chart indicates, unemployment has soared since the program became law. 3 million more Americans are out of work than when it was passed. Unemployment is the highest since the Depression of the 1930s. Small business failures and home and farm foreclosures are at the highest level in 50 years. The problem is real. It's serious. Many people in our nation are truly suffering. That doesn't mean that we should give up. We Americans have faced far greater problems in the past. For example, in the 1930s with the Depression, or after our fleet was destroyed at Pearl Harbor. Each time we've met the challenge, we will again. But what should we do? First, let's look at the tax increase program outlined by the President tonight. It is absolutely true that deficits must be reduced. But it is estimated that even with the Reagan tax increase proposal, deficits may still run as high as $450 billion over this 3-year period, more than triple the increase in the national debt in any other 3-year period in our nation's history. It's true that the tax bill now before the Congress has some good features. It does close some tax loopholes that need closing. The average working American certainly pays his or her share of taxes, and everyone else should too. Democrats in the Senate worked hard to make it a fairer bill. We tried to take out the provision raising telephone taxes. We offered an amendment to retain the present level of medical deductions. We attempted to take out the section of the bill which imposes withholding taxes on savings accounts. Senate Democrats also tried to knock out the increase in unemployment taxes. Unfortunately, those Democratic amendments lost. Now we're faced with a tax bill that has both good and bad provisions. Regrettably, at this point, members of Congress can't vote for some of the provisions and against others. They have to vote for or against the entire bill as one package. One thing is clear. Whatever the outcome of this tax package, it certainly is not going to end the recession or put our people back to work. We simply can't keep saying prosperity is just around the corner. To ask the millions of unemployed Americans to wait for some distant recovery is like a fireman telling the people in a burning building not to worry, it may rain next week. In this time of economic crisis, all of us in the Congress have a responsibility to work for positive solutions. We Democrats are offering a positive plan to help end the recession. It's aimed at bringing down the unfair, unworkable interest rates which are strangling our economy. Let's look at what high interest rates are doing to all of us. 5 years ago, the average monthly payment on a $65,000 house was $500. Today, the payment on that same house would be $875 per month just because of higher interest rates. 86% of the people in this country can't even qualify to buy that house. Is it any wonder that there are hundreds of thousands of carpenters, electricians, and bricklayers out of work? Is it any wonder that farmers are going broke when they cannot afford to borrow the money to plant their crops? High interest rates are also a major cause of the big government deficits that we've been discussing this evening. Every time the interest rate goes up 1%, the cost of government borrowing goes up $7 billion. High interest rates also increase unemployment. If the 3 million people who lost their jobs in just this last year could be put back to work, it would reduce the deficit by $90 billion. For many years, interest rates were rather stable. Usually interest rates have ranged between 2 and 3 percentage points above inflation. People who wanted to expand their farms and businesses and put people to work could get stable and reliable credit at reasonable rates. In the last 3 years, all of that has changed. Interest rates have skyrocketed. Instead of being 2 or 3 points above inflation, they've jumped to about 10 points above inflation. Interest rates have not only been too high, they've been unstable and erratic. No one knew where they would go next. Investment decisions became impossible to make. It's important for every American to understand why this has happened. In October of 1979, the Federal Reserve Board decided to embark on a controversial experiment with tight money and high interest. They decided to no longer use their powers to maintain reasonable and stable interest rates. This dangerous experiment has obviously had tragic results. Lost jobs, lost farms, even lost homes. Faced with this economic emergency, we have hoped that the administration would act, but instead they have continued to support this dangerous experiment with high interest rates and tight money. Mr. Stockman, the budget director, said just recently of this high interest rate policy, we endorsed it, we urged it, we have supported it. The time has come to change this policy. Senate Democratic Leader Robert Byrd and House Majority Leader Jim Wright, with a large number of Democrats from both houses, have introduced a bill to require the Federal Reserve Board to bring down interest rates and to maintain them at stable levels. If interest rates today were at their historic level in relation to inflation, they would range between 7 and 10% instead of the 14 to 21% range of the past 2 years. This proposal is a sound and reasonable one. It's based on solid experience under both Democratic and Republican administration. I hope that the President will join us in this effort. Interest rates should not be a partisan issue. We're all Americans. We're all in the same boat.
Today, Jones doesn't have a primary opponent in this Tuesday's elections, but he'll face either Dick Freeman, Bob Nichols, or Carl Suggs on the Republican ticket in November. Since Congress is on a 2-week recess, Jones will be home to hold several events in the area. Most of those activities, he says, will be related to his duties in Washington, but others will be focusing on his campaign.
We're in a district work period now, so I'll be here through Labor Day, and most of the time is going to be tied up strictly on congressional business. We're going to have the mobile office out and some town hall meetings, but we'll be doing some campaigning also in our spare time.
Jones also talked about his 2 strongest Republican challengers, Dick Freeman and Robert Nichols.
Well, he hasn't done anything since 2 years ago, and it seems like he's more interested in being a perennial candidate than he is in public service.
And Bob Nichols, do you see anything there?
I've never heard of him. He's never written to us, to my knowledge, except he issued one.
Restaurant in Tulsa. Becky?
Well, thank you very much, Diana. We are here at Carl's restaurant. Carl all of the candidates has had a long, hard day. He told me he started out at 3 a.m. this morning and has been going hard at it ever since. Throughout the day, throughout this campaign, Carl Suggs' optimism has been high. Carl's joining us this evening, and Carl, thanks for stopping by to talk to us. And your optimism really has been high, even though you said you have not had a lot of money to spend. You have not had a large army of volunteers out there helping you, yet you have kept that high optimism.
You bet. We've got the right side of the issues, I believe, and we're showing people that I don't have any axes to grind except just to try to bring back the common everyday person's voice to Washington.
You told me earlier that you have been traveling throughout the district, visited some of the small towns. How much are you hoping and counting on their vote?
Well, I'm counting on everyone's vote, but the small towns are oftentimes forgotten. And no one can afford to forget anyone, no matter whether they're small town, big town, or anywhere in between.
Of course, as you know, it has been reported today that there is a light voter turnout. How will this affect your election?
I really don't feel like whether it's light or heavy, it'll really have a whole lot to do with it. Basically, I feel like the people are beginning to speak. They're beginning to understand that they're going to have someone in Washington that's going to listen to them for a change, rather than listening to the Washington political machinery.
I know you're not hoping for a runoff, but if a runoff would come about, would you campaign as you have during this primary against the incumbent James R. Jones, or do you feel you'd go more head-to-head with your GOP opponent?
Well, Jim Jones is the person we need to get out of Washington. We need to get someone with integrity up there. We need to get someone who will fight for what the people here are saying. And so I really have to feel like Jim Jones is the man that I need to attack, if that's the word you want to use for it. I don't feel like you can win a campaign slinging any mud. Everybody gets dirty that way. We just have to go strictly on the issues, and once we get the voting records out to the public where people can see what has been actually done in Washington, I think they'll see that the choice is very clear.
Carl, throughout this campaign, you have said that you consistently back President Reagan's economic programs. How would you have voted on this $98 billion tax hike that, of course, the president did support?
Well, I had very serious reservations concerning the withholding tax provision. Withholding of interest and dividends taxes, I didn't feel like that was the way to go. Now, they did soften that because you have to have almost $3,000 in the bank before you reach that $150 minimum. So it will not affect the small saver like I thought it would at first. But President Reagan was elected to be our leader, and we need some people who will back a leader. He's shown more leadership than most of the presidents we've had in the past many, many years.
Jim Jones voted against the tax hike, as of course I know that you know, yet you've said throughout your campaign that Jones is a big spender, is a big taxer.
It's a little bit more active right now. Balloons are out. People are starting to filter in. And as you know, we just had some of the first reports about the precincts that have come in. Right now, Bob Nichols is trailing the other contender, one of the other contenders, Dick Freeman, by a small margin, and we're here to get campaign manager George O'Connor's reaction. Do you think that a trend is being set?
No, I don't think so. So far in the election, we've always been a little behind, and at the end of the election, we picked up more speed, and we look for that to happen tonight. We're a little behind now, but as the precincts come in, we're sure that we're going to pick up a lot of speed and win by a large margin.
George, Bob started out as a virtual no-name and did not pour as much money into this campaign as did perhaps his other two contenders. And Dick Freeman is said to have had over 2,000 volunteers. Do you think this is hurting your campaign?
I've never heard that before, that he had 2,000 volunteers. We've had lots and lots of volunteers. He's had more money than us. We've done a lot more footwork than he has, and we'll see how it all works out, I guess, tonight.
Okay, they're showing some of the numbers right now on the screen, as you can see. Well, you can't see it now, but Bob Nichols, I believe, had 33% of the vote, and Dick Freeman did have 45. There it is again, 46% of the vote, and I believe that is 38% of the vote. What's your reaction to that?
Well, hopefully we'll start picking up some momentum here. We don't look forward to a runoff. We want to win this, and we want to win it big, and hopefully as more precincts come in, as I said, we do just that.
Where do you see your strongest opposition to be? Is this a two-way race, or is this a three-way race?
I thought it was more of a two-way race. Obviously, Suggs has pulled in some votes there. It's going to be interesting to watch.
Okay, thank you very much, and now let's go back to the studio.